Hello everyone and welcome to the reproductive system. In this chapter we're going to be discussing a lot of cool and interesting facts. We're going to start with the male anatomy and physiology, and then we're going to move on to the female, and then finally we'll wrap things up by talking about puberty and sexual differentiation, basically when we're conceived, what determines if we're male or female. So as I said, a lot of neat and interesting topics we're going to discuss, so let's get started. Let's begin with an overview of some terminology of the reproductive systems. So first off, I want to introduce this term gonads, and gonads are the specific sex organs in both male and females that produce gametes, which are the cells or the cell structures that actually form or make the baby. So the male gonad are called the testes or the testicles, and the female gonads are the ovaries. So both of these are responsible for making the gametes. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is the male testes make sperm, and the sperm is the gamete of the male. And then ovaries in the female make what we call ova or ovums, and another way of saying that in layman's terms, we can just say eggs. And eggs is the gamete of the female. So the ovaries produce eggs and the testes produce sperm. Sperm and eggs get together, and 9 months later, hopefully, we have a healthy baby. So that's what the gonads do. The gonads are also responsible for secreting our sex hormones. Now, this is not just they don't work alone. The pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, plays a very big role in interacting with the testes and ovaries, but once they get that feedback and once they're talking and getting instructions, what the testes make is a very important hormone called testosterone. And what the females mainly make are two sex hormones called progesterone and estrogen. Now, before we create any misconceptions or misnomers, guys do have estrogen. That is a known fact, and females, you have testosterone. Okay, it's just mainly in the male body, you're going to have a lot more testosterone than estrogen and progesterone. Ladies, you have testosterone, but you're mainly going to have estrogen and progesterone in your body based on your endocrine system and your physiology. Okay, but we all have these hormones. It's just in trace amounts depending on your sex. Now, we're also going to have accessory organs. We're going to have all sorts of cool ducts. The guys are going to have things like the vas deferens and the epididymis and the seminal vesicles and the ejaculatory duct, all sorts of tubes. The females are going to have other tubes as well. They're going to have the tube that connects the vaginal canal to the uterus. They're going to have the fallopian tubes. We're going to talk about all of that information. But the most important thing of this entire chapter, if you don't listen to a word I say, my feelings won't be hurt. But, of course, the main job of the reproductive system, the main job of the testes and the ovaries is to make a baby, right? You can live a totally normal life without ovaries. People have radical hysterectomies all the time. Take out the uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries. They're okay. They just can't get pregnant. Same thing with guys. You can remove both testicles. You just can't fertilize an egg. But you can live a completely, somewhat normal life. The main job of these organs is to make babies. Hence the name reproductive. So as I mentioned, we're going to begin with the male, and then about halfway through we'll talk about the female and bring it all together at the end. So as we were talking about on the previous slide, the male gonad is called the testes, or the testicles, and they make the male gamete, which is called sperm. Now, we have to make the sperm and the testes, though, and there's a specific area of the testicle where sperm is made, and they are called seminiferous tubules. And these things are really, really cool under the microscope. They look like kiwi. And in this picture, in this cut, this frontal section of the testicle, what you're looking at specifically are these kind of lobules or these columns that I'm highlighting in green. Those are called the seminiferous tubules, and that's also known as the sperm factories. This is where we're going to begin the process of making sperm. So, the beginning process, as we are starting to make sperm, we have these cells called spermatogenic cells, and after several days and several different chemicals and hormones added to them, they are eventually going to become sperm. And then they are going to be secreted into this kind of horse tail or shrimp looking thing that I'm pointing to in purple. I'll highlight it in black as well so you can see it a little better. This whole thing right here, this is called the epididymis. And the epididymis is where sperm is going to mature. I'll have a slide on that in just a little bit. But the spermatogenic cells begin in the seminiferous tubule, and we're going to make sperm in that area. And then eventually we're going to send it to the epididymis. And that is where sperm matures. And then once sperm is ejaculated, once it leaves or begins the process of leaving the male's body, what's going to happen is the epididymis is going to begin to contract. We're going to release some testicular fluid. It's going to go up this very convoluted tube, and it's going to actually move upward towards the pelvic cavity. It's going to go behind the bladder. It's going to join with the prostate, and it's eventually going to leave through the male penis. And we'll show you some anatomy on that in just a little bit. But that's the beginning of sperm and kind of the pathway of sperm. It starts in the seminiferous tubules, number 1. Then it goes to the epididymis, number 2. And then it's going to leave through this tube, which I'll show you again in just a little bit. One more note on this slide are the interstitial cells. And the interstitial cells are these really neat cells. They look like these kind of pizza or triangle looking cells inside the testes, kind of on the outside of all these seminiferous tubules. And I do want you to know the other name for these cells. Another name, or a more common name instead of interstitial, are called the Leydig cells, named after the person, the scientist who discovered them. So Leydig cells, Leydig. And what they do is produce testosterone. Now, as you can see in the notes, it says produces androgens and then dash testosterone. So as I mentioned, guys do have estrogen and progesterone. Females do have a little bit of testosterone. Androgens are kind of like the precursor sex hormones. And of course, guys are going to be making a lot more testosterone, but in some cases, guys do make estrogen and progesterone, and that is normal. It's just we want it in trace amounts. So androgens are just the precursor to the desired sex hormone. So on this slide, we just want to look at an overview of the male genitalia. So on the images on the top, you see the difference between an uncircumcised penis here with the red star, and then you see a circumcised penis with the green star. And the difference is that males are born with this tissue called the foreskin that covers what a lot of folks call the head of the penis. And mainly in America, a lot of times parents and doctors encourage folks to remove the foreskin due to cleanliness issues. A lot of places throughout the world, and even in America, it's more of a religious thing. But I encourage you to do your research. There's some interesting things. Some articles point to that the possibility of keeping the foreskin can be more stimulating and more pleasurable when they're older and it comes to sex life. The big thing with cleanliness is that there's some research that says you have a lesser chance of getting an STD without the foreskin. So if you are circumcised, it's basically you have a less chance of contracting an STD, but there's stuff that refutes that. So I just encourage you to do your own research, read multiple articles so you can form your own opinion on that. And then the picture on the bottom, I just want to show you some of the internal anatomy. First, you can see what the inside of the penis looks like. We'll talk about those different tissues. Then we already talked about the testis, or testes, plural, or the testicle, That's in green right there. And then that kind of shrimp-looking thing on the backside of the testes in red, that's the epididymis. And I want to just point out a few more structures to you. This kind of pouch-looking thing up here that I'm circling in purple, that's going to be the male bladder, which we've already talked about. Between the male bladder and the penis is the prostate that I'm pointing to in blue. So the pathway of sperm, remember that sperm is born or starts the creation process in the testicle, and then it matures in the epididymis, and then as it's ejaculated, it moves up this tube, kind of goes on top of and around the bladder, and then it goes to the prostate. And then as it reaches the prostate, it'll eventually leave through the urethra, and that's really it. That's the flow. And we'll talk about all the different tubes and the ducts and the organs as we get on with our presentation, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview first. So diving into detail now, let's begin by talking about the scrotum. So what the scrotum is the sac of skin and extra connective tissue that hangs outside of the male pelvic cavity. So basically, it's the sac. It's what holds the testes in place. Now, the purpose. So very different than a female's anatomy, right? All of the female organs are inside the body for the most part, right? Where all of the vaginal canal, the cervix, the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the ovaries, all of that stuff, those organs are inside of the female. Why is it that the male anatomy has the testicles hanging outside of the pelvic cavity? Well, here's why. Because in order for sperm to be viable, which means in order for sperm to be able to live and do their job of procreating, making a baby, they have to be made and kept at a specific temperature, and that temperature is not 98.6 degrees. It has to be a little cooler. So, as you see in the notes, I have it in Celsius, because in America, we're really weird. We're like the only country that does Fahrenheit. You go to Europe and South America and other places, they all use Celsius or centigrade. So that's from a world standpoint, that's more normal. We're odd by using Fahrenheit. Anyway, so 37 degrees Celsius is pretty close to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as we talked about in the past, certain organs need to be a little warmer than this, right? Your heart and kidneys have a lot of that extra adipose tissue around that organ to make it a little warmer. We talked about your blood being around 100, 101 degrees. So certain structures in our body need to be warmer. The testes, or at least where the sperm is, needs to be cooler. So if you take a look, sperm is abundantly produced at around 34 degrees Celsius. And in case you were wondering, 34 degrees Celsius is around 93 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's about a good 5-6 degrees cooler or colder. And that makes a huge, huge difference. So a lot of times when guys are having a hard time conceiving with their partner, a lot of times they tell them to wear looser clothing or put ice around the area to cool off that area. And because maybe if the area is running too warm, you're not making enough viable sperm to actually impregnate your female partner. So how does the scrotum maintain proper temperature? Well, it can move because, I mean, think about summer and winter. We're going to have extreme situations, right? When it's really, really cold out, like when it's snowing and it's 25 degrees outside, well, that's too cold. That we don't want the sperm to be too cold because then it's not going to work at all either. So what the scrotum actually helps do is it pulls the testes closer to the pelvic floor, closer to that 98.6 degrees. So if it's really cold out, the scrotum kind of constricts and wrinkles, and we'll pull it closer to that pelvic floor to warm it up. So we can still make sperm in the winter. Opposite effect in the summertime when it's 105 degrees and very, very humid outside. You don't want the testes anywhere close to that 98.6 degree body. So what happens is the opposite. The scrotal skin kind of relaxes and lets the testes hang lower away from the body to cool that testicular area down. So you see two muscles here. That one is called the dartos muscle, and the other one is called the cremaster muscle. And both of these muscles are going to be working together. As you can see, the dartos muscle is more of the kind of the outer muscle and the skin of the scrotum, and then the cremaster muscle is deep inside. It actually arises from, as you can see, the internal oblique muscles, believe it or not. And that's going to help form that inguinal canal and what we call the spermatic cord. But both of these muscles work together to either bring the testes closer to the body to warm up the testicular temperature, or bring it away from the body to cool it down. And I put this illustration in here just to show you the anatomy. You can see on the left, you see the scrotum just with the skin. The picture in the middle, you can see the two muscles that I just mentioned, the cremaster and the dartos muscles, both of these working together to move the testes up and down, depending on our temperature needs. And then when you remove the muscles, you can actually see that structure I mentioned called the spermatic cord. And the spermatic cord is basically this cord that runs from the testes and epididymis area to the rest of the male anatomy. And what's in here is a big artery, a lot of lymphatic vessels, nerves, also a lot of veins, and also the tube that carries sperm to eventually the outside of the body, or at least to the prostate and then to the urethra outside the body. So nothing new on this slide, just going over external genitalia. We've covered the male penis already. From a urinary standpoint, once again, the urethra runs through the penile tissue, so to drain the bladder, urine goes through that tube and leaves the body. And it's the same tube that actually delivers sperm to the, or semen rather, to the female reproductive tract. Now, urine can clean out sperm residue. So after an orgasm ejaculation, a lot of times the male will have an urge to urinate within a 10, 15, 20 minute window. And that's just the body's way of cleaning stuff out. But also, sperm has an opposite effect of the urine. If you remember, the pH of urine ranges from 4.5 to 8. And unless you're a vegan or really strict vegetarian, you're probably not in that 7 or 8 range. You're probably more 4, 5, or 6. So semen, as we're going to learn, has more of an alkaline pH to it. So it actually counteracts, or basically it's not affected by the acidic urine. It won't be destroyed or killed by urine that's too acidic because of the alkaline properties. And then we've already discussed why the scrotum actually hangs outside of that perineum, outside of that pelvic floor area. It's mainly for temperature regulation. On the next few slides, we're going to introduce accessory ducts. And remember, a duct is just a tube. So I'm going to show you about 2 or 3 structures, and then I'll kind of bring it all together and summarize it for you and how it all works. But our first duct that I want to introduce, or tube-like structure, is the epididymis. We've talked about this before. And this is where the immature sperm arrive from the testes, and the job of the epididymis is to mature the immature sperm. Now, this process takes a while. This process takes about 21 days. But your body is constantly, or a male body is constantly making sperm all the time throughout the day. So even if a male is very, very sexually active, sperm is constantly being sent, or premature sperm is constantly being sent to the epididymis to mature, to eventually procreate and have a baby. That's the whole goal once again. So how it actually leaves the epididymis is during orgasm or ejaculation with the male. Those words are synonymous. The epididymis contracts. There's actual muscles, and they contract. And when they contract, they actually send the sperm, once again, through these tubes, and then eventually towards the bladder and eventually towards the urethra. It doesn't go through the bladder. You know where the bladder is. We haven't talked about the prostate and bulbourethral gland in detail yet. So it doesn't go through the bladder, but I'm just telling you it goes around the bladder, just so you know a general idea of where the anatomy is. So that's the job of the epididymis. It's to mature sperm, and then as the male releases the sperm, it sends it through these tubes and then eventually out the body. Let's move on to the next slide and we'll actually cover those tubes. So the tube that actually connects the epididymis to basically the prostate area is called the vas deferens. Now you can see the proper term is the ductus deferens. I do want you to know both of these, but more commonly, if somebody has a vasectomy, right, that's what we're cutting here. So generally speaking, vas deferens is the more common term. So as you can see, it runs up the spermatic cord, so it leaves the epididymis. I guess you can say this is the origin site, and then it terminates or inserts in what we call the seminal vesicle near the ejaculatory duct, which is right near that prostate area, back of the prostate, kind of just under the bladder. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. So all this is a tube, right? And it's just carrying the sperm from point A to point B. And the reason why a vasectomy is a very effective form of birth control is because if you cut that tube, sperm can't get out of the body appropriately or efficiently. Or at all. So therefore, if sperm can't get out of the body, and it's just the fluid leaving the male's body, very, very low chance of becoming pregnant. And then the last tube is the urethra. We've already talked about the urethra, right, in the urinary chapter. So it's just going to carry it until it leaves the body. So just to kind of show you these structures that I just mentioned, in red, right here, once again, the epididymis, kind of on the posterior side of the testes or testicles. And then in black, I'm going to show you this vas deferens. And I'm just going to kind of wave my cursor up and down so you can kind of trace where I'm going here. So this is the vas deferens, or also known as the ductus deferens. And it kind of wraps on top of the bladder, right behind it. And then it joins with another structure called the seminal vesicle. And the seminal vesicle is going to be making the majority of the fluid. And once sperm joins with the fluid, it's now called semen. And what we'll learn in just a little bit is semen is mainly fluid. It's not that much sperm, actually. Even though we're making millions and millions of sperm per ejaculate, it's most of it's just fluid. But that fluid is important. So once the vas deferens runs together with this seminal vesicle right here in purple, it forms this kind of new tube, I guess you can say, and that's called the ejaculatory duct. And then the ejaculatory duct is what goes through the prostate gland. This kind of, I'll circle it in, let's do blue again. Here we go. So that's the prostate. The ejaculatory duct runs through the prostate and then meets up with the urethra. And you can see, if we take a look at this picture, here's the bladder in black, and there's the urethra that I'm highlighting also in black. Kind of. There we go. So the ejaculatory duct actually runs and combines with the urethra, and that is how the semen will eventually leave the male body. Now that we've talked about the tubes, let's discuss structures that actually contribute to what's going into the tubes. So what's going into the tubes is semen. And semen is the fluid that the sperm is floating in, or more accurately swimming in. And without this fluid, the sperm will die and they won't be able to swim and get to their final destination of the egg to make a baby. So this fluid, semen, is very, very important. And all three of these structures that I just put a check mark by are contributing to what goes in the semen. So first and foremost, let's talk about the seminal vesicles. You do have two of them in the male anatomy. You have a left one and a right one. And they contribute the majority of the semen. As you can see, about 60% of the semen just comes from these structures alone. And it creates this kind of yellowish, thick fluid. And it's got several things in it. And let's talk about these several things that are very, very important to keeping sperm alive. Number one, nutrients. The main nutrient is going to be sugar. It's going to be fructose. And as we've talked about before with the metabolism and nutrition chapter, sugar makes ATP, right? And the more ATP we have, the more swimming we can do to get to the egg. And it's a very, very long journey for the sperm. Sperm are very, very small cells. They're microscopic, and they have a very long way to swim. They have to go through the vaginal canal, through the cervix, through the uterus, and then they have to make the choice, do I go through the left fallopian tube or the right fallopian tube? Because there's only one ovulated egg in one or the other. So they have to make sure they don't take a wrong turn, and then they have to keep swimming down that tube until they hit the egg. So for very, very fast swimmers, this can take over either 30 minutes. For some swimmers, it can take days, and obviously those ones are going to be a little too late potentially, unless it depends on when the female is ovulating. We'll talk about that too. That's where the oops happens, where unexpected pregnancies occur. So nutrients, ATP, for the sperm to keep on swimming. Number two, clotting factors. So, semen is a fluid, and not to be gross, we are talking about male and female reproductive anatomy and physiology, so we are going to be talking more about sex as we continue through this lecture, and as the male ejaculates into the female anatomy, it is in a fluid consistency, as you can see. The seminal vesicles secrete a fluid. So, this fluid will easily fall out of the female anatomy after intercourse is done. So what happens is, after ejaculation, and as the semen is sent to the walls of the vagina and around the cervix area, it starts to clot. And that clotting keeps it from falling out of the female anatomy. So after several minutes, an hour or so, it starts to break those clots, and then the sperm can continue to swim up the uterus to the fallopian tube. So it's kind of sneaky. I call there's a lot of ninja factors, if you will. Sperm's one job is to make a baby. So even if we don't want that to happen, if we're trying certain birth controls or whatever, your sperm, your body doesn't care. And same thing with the female anatomy. If you're ovulating, your body wants to have a baby. That's the monthly time for your body to do that. So a lot of ninja factor things going on with the sperm. One of them is it clots, and then it declots or unclots so it can keep on swimming to avoid falling out of the female anatomy. Number three are prostaglandins. And there are four main types of prostaglandins, but regarding the reproductive system, what I want to discuss is this is actually going to cause something called reverse peristalsis. Now let's think about that for a second. What is peristalsis? We just covered that in the digestive system a few weeks ago. Peristalsis is just that involuntary smooth muscle movement, right? We also covered in the urinary system. Our ureters do peristalsis. They move urine from the kidney down to the bladder. So when you swallow food, it goes from your pharynx to your esophagus, right? Your esophagus takes it to the stomach involuntarily. So what is reverse peristalsis? Well, that's the opposite effect. That's where something is moving up or superior. And that's what's happening with these prostaglandins. What they do is they cause the uterine muscle, and the uterus is involuntary muscle, so we're talking about smooth muscle here. It causes the smooth muscle to contract and actually move the sperm up the uterus closer to those fallopian tubes. So as I mentioned, even if the female doesn't want to get pregnant, the female anatomy and physiology does want to get pregnant. If you're ovulating, the uterus will actually try to get pregnant by moving the sperm closer to that egg. So prostaglandins released in the semen by these seminal vesicles actually causes this reverse peristalsis. And then, as we mentioned, it kind of joins in with that vas deferens, and it forms this ejaculatory duct, and then goes into the prostate, and then joins with the urethra as it goes towards the penile tissue. So that was a lot. That was the seminal vesicle. I'll show you a picture of it on the next slide, but make sure that you understand why the nutrients, clotting factors, and prostaglandins are all kind of these ninja factors to make a baby, to achieve pregnancy or fertilization, where the sperm and egg meet. Number 2, the prostate gland. The prostate gland are going to secrete a lot of enzymes to help the semen. Mainly, we're also going to secrete citrate. And that's probably the most important thing that the prostate gland does. Citrate is basically just a sugar. And as I mentioned, with the nutrients, the more sugar we have, the more ATP we can have, the more swimming and faster swimming we can do. So yes, the seminal vesicles are contributing to the ATP, and the prostate gland is also contributing to the ATP. Other things that the prostate does, where I say enzymes, it has this enzyme called PSA, and for some of you who've unfortunately have had folks or friends or relatives with prostate issues, sometimes this gets elevated as folks age. But PSA and other enzymes, what they do is they help dissolve that clotting, the clotting factor. So it's all connected here, which is really, really cool. This is all working together. They help dissolve the clotting factor so the sperm can not fall out and start swimming towards that egg. And other enzymes are basically just like antimicrobial things, where basically they make sure that the female doesn't get a bacterial infection due to us secreting fluid, the male secreting fluid into the female. So protective mechanism as well. And then last but not least, we have the bulbourethral gland. Bulbourethral gland, this is also called Cowper's glands. Sometimes you'll see this in the lab or in different books or websites. Cowper's gland, same thing. And the bulbourethral gland does two things. Number one, it neutralizes that acidic urine. Remember the urine pH from the urinary chapter? If you're a big meat eater, it can be very acidic, 4.5, 5-ish. It can range all the way up to 8.0. But as I said, unless you're vegan or vegetarian, most of us are going to have somewhat of an acidic urine, which could be harmful to the semen. So the Cowper's or bulbourethral glands actually neutralize that by secreting alkaline fluids. And the other thing that it does is it basically lubricates the urethra to make sure that this fluid can get transported efficiently through the urethra so it can get into the female and help with the procreating process. So let's move on to the next slide. I'll show you a picture of these three structures. So let's do this in black first. We're going to do the seminal vesicles. Kind of right behind the bladder, posterior to the bladder, you're seeing a black circle that I'm drawing. Once again, you do have two. You have one on the left, one on the right. We're looking at a lateral view of the male anatomy here. Next, we have the prostate gland that I'm circling in purple, right there. And then number 3 is the bulbourethral gland, aka Cowper's glands. I'll highlight that in green, just under the prostate, kind of posterior right here. And once again, that's going to secrete alkaline fluids to neutralize that acidic urine, but that fluid also helps lubricate the urethra, basically gets it ready for the semen to travel through. So what exactly is semen? As I've mentioned, it's the fluid that comes out of the male body where the sperm is allowed to travel through. It's basically the transport medium, as you can see in the notes. So the actual ingredients of semen, only 5% of it is sperm. The rest of it are the secretions coming from the testicle, coming from the bulbourethral gland, the prostate gland, and remember the majority of it coming from the seminal vesicles. And the nutrient that I mentioned, usually everything we've talked about so far has been glucose, right? Glucose for the brain, glucose for the red blood cells, glucose for the skeletal muscle. But sperm actually uses fructose as its main energy source. Other characteristics of semen. Here you see that there are a lot of chemicals. Some of them we've already discussed, such as the prostaglandins, right, coming from those seminal vesicles, causing the reverse peristalsis and the smooth muscle. I mentioned the uterus, but also the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes here. Relaxin is a hormone, along with other enzymes that help sperm motility, so it helps the sperm be able to swim. So semen allows the sperm, once again, it's a transport medium, so without the semen, the sperm can't swim well. So the stuff in the semen helps it to swim well. We have something called seminoplasmin, which is an antibiotic to help prevent the UTI in males. Remember that urine and semen are both going through the same tube. So we want to make sure that we're not getting any infections in there. And also, we mentioned some of that prostate, those enzymes also making sure that the female doesn't get an infection as well. We talked about the clotting factors, right? After about 15 to 30 minutes, that clot starts breaking down so the sperm can start to swim. And what starts breaking it down is an enzyme called fibrinolysin, along with other ingredients from the seminal vesicles. Basically, it helps break down the clot. And important to note here, the semen is slightly alkaline. If I haven't mentioned that already, remember the urine is generally acidic, so we want to make sure that the male urine isn't too acidic for the semen to kill the sperm. So it kind of neutralizes that, works as a buffer, if you will. But another note is the female vaginal canal is also naturally acidic. A female's vaginal canal should have an acidic pH to fend off any nasty bacteria, yeast infections, those kind of things. So the normal pH bacterial flora of the female canal can also be harmful to semen if it wasn't slightly alkaline. So when you mix this alkaline and this acidic environment, we kind of get this nice neutral medium to where the sperm are not damaged or harmed. And then at the bottom, you can see the normal amounts, and this is a very large range for normal. In an ejaculation, it can range anywhere from 2 to 5 milliliters of semen, and this really just depends on a few factors, but the main one being how sexually active the male is. If it's been a very long time since his last encounter ejaculation, usually the volume will be really large towards that 5 milliliters. If the male is very sexually active, it'll be lower towards that 2 milliliters. It just depends, because the body only makes so much at a time. And you can see 2 to 5 milliliters in 1 milliliter, so per milliliter in one, anywhere from 20 to 150 million sperm are being made here. So, I mean, if you do the math, if we take the extremes at the high end, if an ejaculate has 5 milliliters of semen, and we're talking, 100, 150 million sperm in one sexual encounter, we're talking about 500 million sperm. And only one is going to fertilize that egg versus 500 million. So it's pretty astronomical. It's pretty phenomenal to think how this all works. But once again, this number can greatly vary regarding viability. If the sperm is not at that proper temperature, right, that 93, 94 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to have problems. So we need to make sure that the scrotum is staying cool, keeping the testes away from the pelvic floor. We need to make sure that if we are having sperm issues, that the guy isn't wearing constrictive clothing around the testes. Also, constrictive clothing tends to heat that area up a little bit more too. Our next topic regarding sperm is spermatogenesis. And this is basically genesis meaning forming, creating, right? So this is how we're actually making the sperm cells. And remember, this happens in the testes. So this process of making sperm begins at puberty in the guy, and it continues throughout life. So unlike a female goes through something called menopause, depending on the age. It can be anywhere from 40 to 50 to 60, just depends. But guys actually make their gametes, sperm, throughout their entire life. Now, it definitely slows down, it lowers as the male ages, but it's very different than females. There can be a 70, 80-year-old male who has a baby that impregnates a female. Sperm is sperm. It might be a little harder for that sperm to make that journey and actually fertilize an egg, but it does happen from time to time. So, as you can see in the second bullet point, the process from spermatogonia, which is the most immature, this is basically the very, very beginning of, it's a baby sperm, right? An adult sperm is the only sperm that can be mature enough to actually fertilize an egg and form a baby. So this is a baby version of a sperm. And it takes about 64 days, as you can see, to actually turn into a full-grown adult. Now, once again, this is happening in the testes, but also that maturation process occurs in the epididymis as well. So what happens here is we're going to look at the picture on the right, the image on the right, and we're going to start with this thing called a spermatogonium, which is, once again, the most immature. Spermatogonia is plural, spermatogonium is singular, the most immature baby sperm type. And what it's going to do is it's going to go through mitosis. It's going to make two of these things. And then what happens is only one is chosen to continue this process of making mature sperm. So one of these two daughter cells, if you will, that's what we call them with mitotic activity, right? I guess you can say son cells here, but only one of them continues on in the process, and then we begin the process of meiosis. And recall all the way back to chapter 3 in cytology when we talked about the cell and the difference between mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis happens pretty much with all cells in the body. Meiosis is only your sex cells. So we're going to see this in sperm. We're also going to see this in eggs with the female. So what happens with meiosis is we're going to get a split of genetic material. So we're also going to get exchange of genetic material. So every single cell in your body has 46 chromosomes in it, right? We have 23 from mom and 23 from dad, and that's basically what this is talking about. When you see this 2N right here, and the 2N with the primary spermatocyte, that means it has both sets of chromosomes. So we have 23 from mom, 23 from dad, 23 pairs, right? So we have a chromosome 3 from mom and a chromosome 3 from dad. We have a chromosome 17 from dad and a chromosome 17 from mom. Now, what happens in meiosis is we are going to split this genetic material, and we're going to turn into what we call a haploid state. And that's towards the end of the picture here, the bottom of the picture, you start seeing these 1Ns, and that just means you only have one set of genetic material. So you only have 23 chromosomes in these 1Ns. Now, that should make sense because a sperm is going to meet with an egg, right? So if one of these sperm, mature sperm, has 23 chromosomes in it, and then your female partner has 23 chromosomes in it, when these things get together, we're going to have 46, which is going to make all of the cells in the normal human baby. So we're basically splitting the genetic material, and you're going to have portions of both from mom and dad, right? Every single one of us have characteristics. Maybe some of us are more like a mom or more like our dad, but we all are a mixture somewhat of your mom and dad. If you have your mom's nose, you got your dad's eyes, your mom's hair, dad's build, whatever. But it is a mixture of their genetic material. So once that's all done, as you see, the result is 4 potential sperm, and all 4 are going to have their own set of 23 chromosomes, their own genetic material. And the big key thing here with meiosis is they are different. They are not genetically identical. And this is very important because this is why siblings are different. This is why we're not all identical twins. So I have two brothers, for example, and you take a look, you look at a picture of us when we're younger, we look very, very different. Now that we're older, we kind of look alike. Same mom, same dad, but we all have our own unique traits. I have more of my dad's build, where my two other brothers have more of my mom's build. Um, and it just depends on the variability. And you have tens of thousands of these spermatogoniums going through this meiosis process. So times that by 4, and you're getting just an unlimited amount of variability. So if your parents had 19 kids, all 19 of them would be different, unless they're identical twins, of course. Then they're identical, right? But that's a very different process. 19 different kids, 19 different pregnancies are all going to be genetically different. Now they're going to be somewhat the same because same mom and same dad, but they're never going to be the exact same because of this process, because of meiosis, because of the splitting of that genetic material. So once puberty hits, that spermatogenesis process is kind of nonstop. As you can see, the male can make anywhere from 100 to 300 million sperm per day. And now, as I mentioned, as we age, that number gets closer to that lower number, the 100 million, but still, it doesn't take much to get the job done. So different parts of the anatomy of the sperm, you can take a look at the picture at the bottom and see. It just kind of looks like a thing with a little head and just like a tail, like a tadpole, and that's kind of how it works. The head is the circular part right here, and it's got this kind of protective helmet around it, if you will. It's called an acrosome, and that acrosome has a lot of these enzymes that actually help penetrate and break down the egg. So a lot of folks think that out of these 300 million swimmers, or even more than that, 500 million swimmers in an ejaculation, it's the first one that reaches the egg is what makes or causes the pregnancy, and that's actually not true. It's actually the first one does all the legwork and actually breaking down into the egg. The egg is protected by this big barrier, and the acrosome of that first one helps break it down, and then another one can actually get in and actually fertilize the egg, believe it or not. Moving on to the mid piece, very, very important, the midsection of the sperm. As you can see, it contains a whole lot of mitochondria, boatloads of mitochondria. And remember that mitochondria is our powerhouse of the cell, right? So the more mitochondria you have, the more ATP you can make. And remember, we were talking about all of those enzymes and those nutrients, the fructose and the citrate from the prostate. All of that is going to be sent to the mitochondria and turned into ATP because our sperm has a very long way to go in order to make it to its final destination. And the tail is just a extension of the cytoskeleton, very similar to cilia, but it's not quite cilia, same kind of proteins-ish. But what we call this is a flagellum, and flagella plural, meaning tail. And with the help of all of that ATP from that mitochondria, this thing is able to just literally swim like a tadpole would in water, and just swim with the help of that semen through the female reproductive tract to eventually reach that egg. Okay, and then the last thing we need to discuss with the male before moving on to the female is the sexual response. So, generally speaking, in order for the male to have an ejaculation, there needs to be an erection first. And an erection is where the penis fills up with blood. There is a lot of vasculature in the penile tissue. And basically, it's just a whole bunch of arteries that can fill up and drain based on nervous system control. Now, what I just said is very important. It's nervous system controlled. As you can see specifically with the erection, it's controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. So, remember, the parasympathetic is our rest and digest. That's kind of our chill mode, our hanging out mode. So you have to be kind of calm in order to get this this erection, in order to get this accomplished. So a lot of times if a male is very, very stressed out or is on some type of drug, sometimes that can be inhibited and the male wouldn't be able to get erect even though he wants to. Also, with that said, the erection, once again, controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, it doesn't exactly have to be a sexual response. If the male is relaxed and in a parasympathetic state, males can easily get erections without any sort of sexual stimulation. And the key example is generally right in the morning when a male wakes up, they have an erection. And it's not because right when they wake up, sex is on their mind. Well, it could be, but sometimes it's really just, what have you been doing the last 8 or 9 hours? You've been sleeping, so you're at an all-time parasympathetic high. So once your body awakes from that, you're still in that parasympathetic state, and you start transitioning to sympathetic, but for a little bit, until you go to the bathroom or walk and get blood flow into other areas, generally guys do have an erection. Also, I mean, throughout the middle of the night, several times. If you look at just the sleep cycle, several times, males will get random erections through the middle of the night, not because they're dreaming of sex, it's just because they're in a relaxed state. So I've gotten several parents throughout the years ask me about this with their kids, and you know, they'd have 6-year-old, 10-year-old kids watching, you know, Finding Nemo or you know, playing a video game or reading a book, and like nothing related to any sex, sex content, and they have an erection, and the mom you know, is alarmed by it and scared and you know, wants to know like what's going on. It's, you know, what is the kid doing? They're having a good time. That's it. They're not exactly thinking of sex. They're just in a parasympathetic state, right? They're in the rest and digest mode. They're chilling. They're playing their video game. They're watching their movie. It's a fun, easy-going book, and they're just having a good time. So it's not always about the sexual response. But going back to the sexual response, when you are thinking about sex, the arterioles, all those blood vessels, they have to be engorged with blood in order for that erection to happen. So when there is no sexual arousal and when we're not in that real chill parasympathetic state, those arterioles are constricted and there's no blood flow, or there's very little blood flow to the area, and the penis is what they call flaccid or not erect. And that's kind of how Viagra and other erectile dysfunction drugs work. Is basically it's a vasodilator. So what Viagra does for somebody who can't get an erection is they dilate these constricted arterioles. And when you dilate something, fluid flows in there, blood flows in there, which causes an erection. All right, so moving from the erection to the ejaculation state. Once a male is having intercourse or any sexual activity and they're stimulated enough, what happens is the sympathetic nervous system kicks in the drive here. So remember, this is more of our fight or flight. And what ejaculation is, definition, is basically the semen leaving the body. A lot of things happen, as you can see. Bladder sphincter muscles constrict. And what this does is it allows the urine in the bladder not to leave the body. So semen is leaving and urine is kind of locked in, can't go anywhere, which is good, right? We don't want that fluid mixing. A lot of those ducts, the epididymis, the vas deferens, a lot of those accessory glands, the prostate gland, a lot of different muscles constrict, and that's part of the orgasm, the pleasurable experience for a guy. And as I just mentioned, the muscles also help contract and propel the semen to the urethra to get it out of the body. Now, it's a sympathetic response. So other symptoms, not symptoms, sorry, it's not a pathology, other indicators of an ejaculation would go hand in hand with the sympathetic nervous system response. So a lot of times when guys are going through this, sweating can occur, maybe some goosebumps, dilated blood vessels, dilated pupils, anything that corresponds with our fight or flight response, you'll see in a male orgasm or in a male ejaculation. So the ejaculation and the orgasm in the guy kind of go hand in hand. When a guy ejaculates, he is orgasming, or vice versa. We'll see it's a little different in the female as we keep moving on. So last slide for the male, I just kind of wanted to show you an illustration of what we're talking about. So on this top area right here where I drew the separation, this top area, we're looking at a non-erect or a flaccid penis. And you can see this cross-section here of all of these arterioles. Only the dark red areas, kind of right here, have blood flow in them. And everywhere else it's basically drained. So the tissue is very soft and not erect. If you look at the bottom picture where you'll see an erect penis, you'll see that all of those arterioles, those blood vessels, are engorged with blood. So, not to be gross or anything, but it is a very common misnomer that I need to talk about. There is no bone tissue in the male penis. So the term, I think you know what I'm talking about. That's only said because of the hardness due to the blood flow area, the dilation of these arterioles in the penis. So there is no bone tissue. So you can't technically fracture this tissue with any kind of trauma. You can damage it. You can tear. There's muscle in there. You can tear that, but there's nothing to break. All right. So we've talked about the male anatomy. We talked about the scrotum and the testes and the penis and the prostate and all the different glands. We talked about how sperm is formed, where it's formed. And we talked about how it leaves the body, and we talked about the properties of sperm and semen. And now we just finished with this male sexual response, so let's move on to the female. We'll do the same thing. We'll cover some anatomy, some physiology, sexual response, and then we'll tie it all together.